Kia ora koutou. Good morning, everyone. My name is Devin Glennie, and I'm here to talk about our building code update for protection from fire. I'm part of the team that helps oversee the building code here and MB as part of the building system performance branch. So we have two sessions today. This morning, we're going to talk about protection from fire. We're going to have a little break after that, and then back at noon to talk about plumbing and drainage. These webinars are being recorded, so they'll be available on our website within a few days or so. And we've asked people to submit questions when they signed up. So we're going to cover off a few of those questions. You'll be also able to answer or ask questions in the Q&A function here in Zoom. The short ones we'll try and answer in text. And if there's anything longer, we'll see if we have time to get to those. All right, so let's get started. The first thing we're going to talk about a little bit is, I've just got to change my screen sharing here. 1 second. All right. We're just going to give you some background here about our building code update phases. So the changes we're talking about today have actually been in development for several years. They started off with some of these commissioning standards several years ago and publishing those standards, and then consulting on the changes into the acceptable solutions and verification methods. So that consultation for the building code occurred in May 2022. There are over 100 submissions received across the different proposals. We then analyzed the submissions, considering all the feedback. We announced decisions on these topics in May this year. And then the new documents were all published online last week. So now that the new documents have been published, we're entering a implementation and monitoring period. We're going to look at the changes and see how they're landing and help the sector get up to speed on those changes. These updates are important to New Zealanders because the public expects our buildings to be safe, durable, warm, dry, healthy, and have a low impact on the environment. You may have seen this before, but it's the building code triangle. It shows the building code regulatory framework as a series of tiers. So at the top, it's the Building Act, and below that is the building code, which sits in regulations, Schedule 1 of the Building Regulations 1992. But most people think about the building code as being a whole system. So it's the building code regulations, along with the verification methods, acceptable solutions, guidance documents, and information that sit below it. So when we talk about updates, it could be any one of these tiers in the building code. Today, we're going to be primarily focused on the changes to the acceptable solutions, as well as some of the standards that have been cited within those acceptable solutions. So what ways can people comply with the building code? If we're talking about protection from fire, there's 3 general ways that people might look at it. The acceptable solution CAS1 generally applies for simple building types. So these people, the users for these documents could be anyone, could be designers, it could be LPBs, it could be fire engineers looking at these simple kind of structures. When we get to larger buildings, so things that are slightly bigger, could be commercial buildings, but still typically developed kind of at scale or very similar fashion. We generally talk about different design teams or designers having some knowledge using those documents, and that's provided in acceptable solutions CAS2. Or we have more complex buildings where we have professional engineers involved, architects, and we're trying to do something that maybe doesn't fit the mold of the acceptable solutions. That's where we have our verification method CVM2. So like I said, we're primarily going to be focusing on those 2 acceptable solutions today. And talking about some of the changes that have been updated in them. So the first question we got from the webinar signups, one of the popular things is, when do these changes take effect? So like I mentioned, the new documents were actually published last week, which means that they can be used the day they are published. However, there is a transition period that allows you to use the previous documents for the next year. So at the end of the transition period, older documents can no longer be used. During the transition period, both documents can be used to show compliance with the building code. And so these were published on the 2nd of November, and they'll be used until November 1st next year. All right, so what topics are we talking about here today? There are two main topics we are covering. The first proposal relates primarily to acceptable solutions CAS1 and the requirements for risk group SH. This covers residential homes and those kind of simple outbuildings. The second proposal or topic was on fire safety systems, which affects the standards used and some of their citations within the acceptable solution CAS2, CVM2, as well as F7 warning systems. So two of these documents, CAS1 and F7, they're both published in our new document template. So if you haven't seen this before, it's been used in other parts of the building code since 2021. Some of the key features of the new document template, I guess, is that CAS1 has been split from CVM1. They originally were published together, and now they've been split out into their own separate documents. CVM1 has been provided with a new introduction, but otherwise no other changes to its requirements. The cover page of the new documents state the year they were published as well as their amendment history. So you no longer have to flip to an amendment history section. You can look at on the first page of what version it is. The second page covers a preface and a short description of the building code and the status of the document. Third page is actually a list of the main changes in the version. So you can read a summary of what the changes were within the document itself. And then this is followed by just a section on the key features of the document, how different icons and italics and hyperlinks are used. Some of the other things that have changed within the text, we have a consistent set of numbering and headings, so that each document has the same kind of flow, and which is the heading number, which is the paragraph. It's a single column format, so it's no longer two columns side by side. And there's a standardized set of appendices. So Appendix A lists all the cited standards and references in the document. Appendix B lists all the defined terms. If you're looking for building code regulations, the code clauses themselves, these aren't published in the acceptable solutions, but there is a link on each of the code clause pages that takes you straight to the legislation website where you can see these. So if you go to clause C4, you can click on this button, and it's above where you would click to download an AS or a VM. It's above that part of the page, and it'll take you directly to that link to see that. So if you're looking for those code clauses, you can get that from the website quite easily. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about before we get into our building code updates is actually about the building product information requirements. Just highlighting that these come into force on 11th of December this year. So this provides minimum information for all products manufactured or imported in New Zealand on or after that date of 11th of December. We've been working with a lot of the importers, manufacturers, and retailers about what this means for them. And now we're going to start talking to people about what it actually means for designers and BCOs. So this minimum information gives you better access to the information about the building products and how they would comply with the building code. It sets out some minimum requirements such as installation or maintenance requirements, descriptions of the product, its intended use, and most importantly, it now requires information about the code clauses that are relevant to a product and how it's expected to contribute to building code compliance. We expect this will help support some of those building consent applications because you'll be providing a minimum consistent level of information on those products, and also expecting to help some of these alternative solutions where the products that are being sold or imported in the country don't comply with the standards that are in the acceptable solutions verification methods, but may have been tested in other ways overseas, for instance, and that information can be provided on those information sheets. So that's just a heads up about this. If you want more information, there's a link there at the bottom, building.gov.nz/BPIR or building product information requirements. There's a number of resources on that page or link from that page, including videos and webinars and about the requirements themselves. Okay, so now we're going to get into our talk about the first topic, which is protection from fire for residential homes, or CAS1. I'm going to bring in Tania Morgan to talk about these requirements. Tania is a senior fire engineer in our building engineering team. She holds a master's degree in fire engineering from the University of Canterbury, and she's a chartered professional engineer, chartered member of Engineering New Zealand, and a practice area assessor. She has more than 30 years of experience in fire engineering, building regulations, and consenting. Hi, Tania. How are you doing today?
Good morning, everyone. I'm here to overlook some recent changes to the acceptable solution CS1.
So what changes are we making to CAS1?
The main changes are relevant to improvement of life safety in residential home. We revised Part 2. The minimum requirement for the fire alarm is installation of Type 1 system, which is now interconnected smoke detectors, complying with a New Zealand standard 4514, which been updated in 2021. We also revised Part 3. We clarified what escape route comprise of and requirements. We clarified what final exit may be beyond the exit door of the building. There were some minor changes to Part 7, mostly this to align with changes made in CS2 in 2020. We updated some standards to new versions and aligned appendixes with CS2. All these changes would have absolutely marginal impact on the construction cost.
So did we change the scope of risk group SH and what the buildings apply to in CS1?
No, the scope of risk group SH will remain the same. In consultation document last year, we proposed to expand the scope by including more types of multi-unit dwellings. This unfortunately elevated risks, fire risk, and trigger additional fire safety features. Where we receive a generally support for intent for the proposals to expand the scope and increase level of life safety. However, there were concerns that additional requirements would result in significant increase of construction cost, and the document is becoming too complex. As there was limited agreement on proposed fire safety features, the scope of document would have to unfortunately remain as is, and this is basically limited to simple building types. Our intent is that CS1 cover low-rise residential dwellings where people sleep and provide affordable and simple solutions to comply with the requirements of the building code.
All right, so you mentioned improvements to life safety, and you mentioned the interconnected smoke alarm, the Type 1. Saskia is going to be talking about that a little bit later. But what about those other improvements to life safety, those in Part 3? What changes do we make there?
Okay, in Part 3, we updated section means of escape. Previous version of CS1 contained only some minimal provisions for means of escape and focus on the length of escape routes. There were several items which been unclear. What we've done, we have added more clarity on the requirements for the escape routes. We explain what escape routes comprised of, how to measure escape routes, the requirements for height, width, doors, locks, and more clarity on the external escape routes and location of final exit. These all details would provide more clarity and enable more consistent designs and BCA interpretation of the requirements, hopefully.
So let's talk a little bit more about those external safe paths. Where might this apply?
The external safe path is required where there is only one direction of escape to final exit. This is a very common situation for densified construction. Typically, it would be for multi-unit dwellings or where there would be multiple buildings on site. External escape routes have to be designed so that occupants can reach a final exit with low likelihood of injuries. Occupants should not be exposed to radiation during escape or any falling debris. The final exit is location where occupants can disperse, or egress is provided at least in two directions. Final exit is typically a street or open space.
So what are the options to protect the external safe path? What's been developed for CIS1?
Well, there is three options, and hopefully our figure 3353 and description in paragraph 3353 would help you to visualize what the options are. One of the options, its external safe path should be separated from a building minimum of 1 meter from any adjacent buildings or fire cells. The second option is fire-rated construction. In densified situation, it's maybe not possible to separate external escape path. So we're asking for full length from ground to the roof fire-rated construction, which is adjacent to external safe path wall. We also have option if nothing of this would be possible, for whatever reason, providing fire sprinkler system in fire cell adjacent to the external safe path.
So if we're talking about the first option, separating by distance, we also have to account for the width of the external safe path. That's right?
Figure should show that we're basically asking a 1 meter separation distance to the external safe path, and also we clarify that external safe path should be minimum of 1 meter. It's actually aligned with CS2, so no new requirements.
All right. And if we're trying to protect people, why are we fire rating the entire external wall? Why don't we just fire rate up to the height of a person? Why do we have to fire rate the height above that?
Good question. It's been asked at last seminar, so I will try to elaborate a little bit. Fire engineers probably all know, but I'm not sure what the audience is today. During the fire, there is some event which might happen. It's called flashover. And during this fire, flashover may happen very, very fast. For a typical average household room, it's maybe even less than 5 minutes. And in event of flashover, the result is that all windows break, and fire, flames, and debris is actually coming out of the windows. So in densified construction, occupants have early warning system by interconnected wireless smoke alarm, but standard New Zealand standards 4514 does not require interconnection with adjacent units. So by the time when neighboring buildings would know about a fire and try to escape, even if safe path is provided, the debris might fall from non-fire rated windows. So this was a reason that basically people have to be protected, not only from flames and radiation during the fire escape, but also from a debris that may fall on occupants or firefighters from the above. Therefore, the all adjacent to escape route external walls should be fire rated all the way up to the roof.
All right. So you briefly talked about some of the other changes we made in the document. Do you just want to recap some of those?
There was limited changes to the rest of the document at this time. We just aligned appendixes, and we aligned appendixes with CS2. There was minor changes to part 5, which we basically align appendixes and table, so they basically align, and status quo for part 5 still remain. There was some minor changes for part 7. Once again, we just aligning changes made to CS2 in 2020. And There was some wording in appendixes change, reciting newest version of standards in Appendix A, updating some definitions in Appendix B, and providing absolutely the same appendixes, aligning them with CS2 for fire safety systems and fire testing.
And we had a question submitted before the webinar. Has the requirement for structural stability, so structural fire stability, been changed in CAS1?
At this stage, there was no more clarity in CS1, no additional requirements being added to Part 2. Generally, structural stability is covered in Museum Building Code Clause B1, which requires the account shall be taken of all physical conditions, including the affect the stability of building and building elements, and this would include stability in fire event.
And another question we had, does CAS1 require a fire rating between a residential unit and an adjacent flat?
As I mentioned, it's no changes to Part 5, and paragraph, old paragraph 5.1.2 provide requirements for the notional boundary. Where there is separate household unit on the property, the notional boundary should apply between those units. And if required, one or both of household units may require fire rating, basically if it's less than 1 meter to notional boundary. For outbuildings, these which are not household units, notional boundary would not need to apply on the same property. But if it's separate property garages or outbuildings, the requirements of Part 5 would require fire rating. Attached share garages require a fire separation from each household unit to other property as defined in the scope of the document.
All right. We had some other questions here about existing buildings. Do these changes apply retroactively to existing residential buildings?
No, the requirements do not apply retrospectively unless there is alterations to the building or change of use. This would be covered under Section 112 and Section 115 of Building Act. Landlords should keep in mind there is requirements for Residential Tenancy Act and requirements for alarm and so on. However, there have not been changes known to this act as a result of the changes in CS1, not up to date.
All right. Well, thank you, Tania. We're now going to bring in Saskia to talk a little bit more about the fire safety systems. So she's going to come in here. There we go. Saskia is a senior fire engineer with experience in both industry and government in the Caribbean and Ontario and here in New Zealand. She's been part of our building performance and engineering team for the last 4 years or over 4 years. She was a past committee member for several of the New Zealand fire safety system standards, as well as the International Society of Fire Protection Engineering's Committee on Performance-Based Design. Welcome, Saskia.
Thanks, Devin, and great to be here.
All right, the fire safety systems. We'll start off with the standards. Can you tell us what changed in the standards, or which standards changed?
We've had updates to the alarm standard 4512, and with that, the smoke alarm standard 4514. Their sprinkler one was updated in 2020 4541. And then the Australian standard for ventilation has been updated as well. So with this acceptable solution update, we've included all the new versions, new citations of these standards. Sorry?
Keep going, yeah.
A lot of people are using especially the New Zealand standards already, so they're probably familiar with the changes in them. The fire alarm one, for instance, now includes wireless options, has not relevant to the acceptable solution, but more robust requirements for documentation of the systems. The visual alerting devices specifications have been expanded, and there's the technology updates that have happened throughout the years have been included in there. The interconnected smoke alarms for houses also now allows for wireless interconnectivity. And the standard itself has been updated with more relevant text. Some duplication has been removed, and also now allows for battery-powered alarms, which it didn't before, as long as they're long life, 10-year batteries. The sprinkler standard, there's been the water supply for tall buildings has been cut down a bit. No risk. The risk hasn't increased, but the requirements have been lessened a bit, so it's more cost effective. There's allowance for hydrant and sprinkler on the same system. And if you look at each standard in the forward, you can see all the changes that have occurred in each of the standards.
Yeah, great. So can you tell me just where these standards are cited in the acceptable solutions and verification methods? Or which documents they cite them?
So they're cited in CAS1. CAS2 is the main document where the requirements are for when you need to install all of these. So CAS2, buildings outside of single-family dwellings, smaller dwelling units. When you need an alarm system, you look in CAS2, part 2 in there. Same for the sprinkler, 4541. Interconnected smoke alarms, you would look into CAS1 because that's more for houses, standalone units. And the smoke control, AS1668, is also CAS2. CVM2 also has some citations for the alarm and the sprinkler, and that's also been updated to the latest edition.
Yeah, so we briefly talked about some of these changes, but can you tell me just a little bit more about the interconnected smoke alarms? When we asked people before the webinar, they said this is what they were most interested in. So what are the main changes in 4514 for interconnected smoke alarms?
So the older version had they needed to be wired in, and they needed to be connected with wires. And now you can have the batteries, long life batteries, and they can be wirelessly interconnected. So that means you don't have to necessarily get an electrician in there every time you want to update your system or install one of these systems. You can, get them at the local hardware store and just put them on the ceiling yourself. The testing requirement is simplified. There was something there that the owner had to do a smoke test with their alarms, and that was removed. And the document, the language and the explanations are aimed towards the homeowner, not necessarily fire engineers. So that's been more explicit. And there's some diagrams in there of locations where they should be installed, some example floor plans, and also some advice on, in certain trouble areas where you might expect more nuisance alarms, which type of smoke alarm to install.
So where are these smoke alarms used? Like what types of buildings where you use an interconnected smoke alarm?
This is aimed for houses. So the single family dwelling, the townhouses, not apartments in larger buildings generally are covered under the fire alarm for that building. This is for the single family residences. The other what we've changed as well. So the alarm standard has changed, and with that, we've changed F7AS1, where the requirements for domestic smoke alarms used to sit for the installation. And now we just point straight to the standard to use that for in design and installation of that system. So that means that instead of just inside bedrooms or just outside the bedrooms, now you have to put smoke alarms throughout your whole house. including living rooms, etc. And that means that if the fire occurs further from your bedroom, there'll be earlier detection and earlier warning because you'll be alerted straight away because the alarms are interconnected.
So we had another question before the webinar, which was, are there cost-effective options for interconnected smoke alarms?
Well, the fact that we are right now, we are allowing battery-operated smoke alarms and wireless interconnected smoke alarms means you don't have to hire an electrician to do that installation. So for new construction might not be an issue, but if you're doing a renovation and an upgrade to your home and your smoke alarm system, that means you can just go out to the hardware store and put them up yourself. The cost is not that much more for the interconnected ones, and as the market grows and overseas, they're also becoming more and more common. We don't expect the prices to go up, but rather go down.
Yeah, and I can testament that there are cost-affordable options. Behind me, up on my ceiling, there's an interconnected smoke alarm, which I installed a few years ago in my own home. It was just done by myself, wirelessly connected, and just required a step ladder and a couple screws. So another question we had, does this changes to interconnected smoke alarms, does it make it mandatory for all houses retroactively in November 2024?
No, we don't do retroactive requirements with the building code updates for fire. So it's only when any work triggers a consent. So either it's new construction, a new home, or a renovation to your house that would require a consent, and that then the council may ask that you upgrade your smoke alarm system as well.
Some of the installation locations are covered in the standard. If they're required throughout a house, will you get a lot of false alarms?
So these are the diagrams that you can find in the standard. And you can see there's, for instance, if you look at the garage, which is a bad place to put a smoke alarm because any car exhaust or even dust that you might have there might set off the alarm. So recommendation is to put a heat detector or a heat alarm in the garage instead of a smoke alarm. You can look at different types, photoelectric, multi-sensor, and see in certain problem areas like outside the bathroom, if there's a lot of steam coming out of the shower, those might trigger the alarm. So you might want a different type of alarm there. Bear in mind, like smoke alarms are getting smarter and smarter as everyone's trying to, the manufacturers are also making them smarter to cut down on the nuisance alarms. So in a couple of years, who knows, they might be a thing of the past.
All right. So we're going to move on a little bit and talk about the other standard fire alarm systems, 4512. What were the main changes? You briefly mentioned them, but what were some of the main changes in that standard?
So the visual alerting devices, which means very simply a flashing light or some kind of visual alert that the fire alarm is going off. It's for deaf and people who are hard of hearing. So they already existed in the alarm for noisy environments. These specifications have been expanded to make them apply to throughout the building, not just for noisy environments, plant rooms and such. Wireless detection technology is now allowed, network systems, duct smoke detection. So all these sections in the alarm standard have been expanded. The committee looked at new industry technology, what was available out there, and made sure the standard is up to date with current technology so we can keep up here in New Zealand. There are some seismic constraints for system components added, and the maximum zone areas. So that's how you program your system. Manual call points, everyone's familiar with those at the exits. The numeric, the quantities, the distances, the walking distance between the manual call points have been expanded a bit. Location requirements have been revised. Yeah, some testing requirements have been made easier to comply with. The type 5, where apartment units and sleeping areas have a specific alarm type system that has been updated, again, keeping with the latest trends and developments. And there are features where smoke detectors can be substituted for heat detectors. So this is in commercial buildings, not just in houses. We also have false alarms there, dusty environments, manufacturing plants, etc. You're allowed to put, if the acceptable solution says you have to have smoke coverage, you're allowed to replace a number of smoke detectors with heat detectors. But that's up to 25%. It is not expected that that's going to have a big impact on the nuisance alarms with fire alarms in commercial buildings.
All right, we'll move on to the fire sprinkler system standard 4541. What were some of the changes there?
So these are just the main changes. The standard itself is a couple of 100 pages long, and try to condense it to one slide for this webinar. But yeah, all the New Zealand standards, as they are getting updated, there's new section numbering. Instead of, I think it was 3 numbers for a clause, and now it's the 1.01, etc. Like I mentioned, buildings over 45 meters high now have to comply with the more robust water supplies instead of at 25 meters. So for buildings between 25 and 45 meters high, the requirements have become a bit less stringent. It's more cost effective, and there is not no increase of risk or that the sprinkler will fail for these buildings. The seismic restraints for the pipework have been updated, and yeah, there's been some changes with car stackers, high piled storage, and warehouse tracking with some research that they've been doing in the States to make sure that we're aligned as well with the latest research and the latest findings.
All right, what about the modifications to this standard? So it's currently cited in CAS 2, it's got some modifications. What happened to those modifications?
So the alarm standard has been cited without modification. The sprinkler standard, because there's some content in there that cannot be consented, and that's the only reason why we've modified it, not because we don't agree with the content. For instance, that fire separations are part of the sprinkler system, whereas we have a whole acceptable solution explaining exactly what the fire separations are. So those were modified to say if you're using the standard to comply with this acceptable solution, then skip this part. It's basically no further changes than they were before. Just the numbers have been changed because the section numbers have changed in the sprinkler standard.
All right. I had another question that we had before the webinar, so it's not covered in these changes. We had a question about residential fire sprinkler systems, so ones that may apply for a single house, a domestic setting. Is this kind of work covered under the Schedule 1 exemptions in the Building Act, or would it require a registered plumber to install a sprinkler system for a residential home?
So the 4517 sprinklers, which is basically it's part of your plumbing, which a commercial sprinkler is not. But 4517 allows for single-family dwellings to use their domestic water supply to install a sprinkler system for life safety. Awesome feature. If you are able to get it in your house, I would certainly recommend it. But because it's part of your plumbing system, you would have to get a plumber or a sprinkler fitter to install it for you.
All right. We'll move on to the fourth standard here, the AS 1668.1. What are some of the main changes in this standard?
Yeah, so that's been the older one has been updated a while ago, so we've just updated our documents as well to reflect that, because most people are using the newer version. There's updates to isolation switches, the signal transmission, how these systems interface, and also requirements on the documentation for each system. One change that did occur in this standard, it's no longer a joint standard, so any mention of our New Zealand alarm standard has been removed. And we cannot, the Australian alarm standard and New Zealand alarm standard are totally different. You cannot comply with both of them. So we've had to go through the document to say wherever it says, and I'm oversimplifying, but where it says that to comply with the Australian alarm standard, we need to make sure that you're complying with the New Zealand version. And we also made sure that with that, there weren't any gaps in the information, sort of smoke detector coverage is still compliant with the New Zealand standard.
Yeah, and so that kind of information that's covered in the modifications, which is in the appendix to CAS2 about the standard.
Yes.
So we talked about the standards. We'll move on here just to talk about some of the other changes to the proposal, some of the other changes made as part of this topic here in CAS2. So what are those other changes?
So because we've updated the citation for the standards, we took the opportunity to look at part 2 where the standards are mentioned, and just did a kind of a cleanup, if you will. We looked at some requirements that have been in our acceptable solution for a number of years, but with changing technology and the way we live nowadays, like there was a requirement for a landline for the fire alarm system to have a landline in your building. We've removed that because everyone nowadays has cell phones, and some other changes like that. We've also looked at the tables like you see here, and table 2.2 is a combination of all what used to be table 2.2A through D, and put them all together. There was a lot of duplicate footnotes that we now only need one footnote, and it's just all on one page, easier to see.
Yeah, and at the same time, we revised table 2.3. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so that was revised. The main change here is that some of the combinations, you have to pick a column and pick a row, and where the two meet, that's your fire safety system requirement. And if you switch the column and the row, then you came up, in some cases, came up with a different number. So we just made sure that that aligned both ways. And sorry, figure 2.1 used to be a paragraph about how to use the table and combine the risk groups, fire safety system requirements in one building. It's informative, so not really suitable for a paragraph, so we made it a figure. So the information is still there, the content hasn't changed, it's just an informative figure. These are the steps.
Yeah, and just lastly, we briefly mentioned that the standards are cited in CVM2. Can you just cover off what changed in CVM2 as part of this update last week?
Literally just 2 years in the reference standards, list of reference standards. We've just changed the year edition of the standard. We haven't done anything to the content of CVM2.
Yeah, and that was just to get those up to date. So if you're using a sprinkler standard, you're using the same one in CVM2 as CAS2, and same with the fire alarm standard as well.
Yes.
All right, well, that wraps up our presentation. We have a number of questions here, so I'll bring you both back on, and I'm going to start going through the questions. I'm going to try and pull out the ones for CAS1 first, Tania, if I can. Let's see here.
I was trying to answer as I was listening to Saskia, but hey on.
All right. There's one here about the external safe paths. Are these requirements applicable to a single unit that contains multiple households?
Building Act require us to protect household units and other property. I'm not quite clear about these questions. My understanding is it's basically several household units on one property.
Yeah, I think it's where you have multiple household units in one building.
In one building. Okay, so we would require a fire separation between separate households if it's in the same building, and this basically would applicable to external safe path because different separate household have to be protected.
We had another one here we covered, but maybe we'll answer it again. Do the changes to the acceptable solutions, do they only relate to new builds, or are they also used for alterations or extensions to buildings?
Well, new version and old version always can be used for alterations or change of use for buildings, but you cannot mix these two versions. No addition 1 requirements partially and partially requirements from version 2. But when you select what version you're using, you have to follow it in full, and this would be only applicable if you do any alterations or change of use for any building.
I'm still scrolling through here. Maybe we'll switch to some of the fire alarm questions, Saskia, as well. I'm just gonna. The wireless interconnected smoke alarms, are they connected via Wi-Fi to each other, or is there another type of signal?
They use radio signals, so you don't have to have Wi-Fi in your home. You don't have to worry if the internet drops out, they will still work.
And another question, are all these standards free?
Yes, they are. I'm not sure if we can share the link somehow, but if you go to the Standards New Zealand website, the alarm and the smoke alarm standard are free. The sprinkler standard, unfortunately, due to copyright issues, there is still a charge for that, but it's reduced a lot from what they used to charge for it. The Australian standards, unfortunately, you have to deal with Standards Australia and pay their fees. But New Zealand standards that we cite are mostly free, except for sprinkler.
Yep, and you can read about the sponsored standards on the Standards New Zealand website. If you just look for what standards are sponsored, there's about 120 that we sponsor access to, so you can download those for free. And like Saskia mentioned, that includes both the fire alarm and interconnected smoke alarm standards. Another question here was about the modifications to the standard. So previously they had modifications. You just want to repeat again which standards are used with modifications in the acceptable solutions and which ones are cited just as is.
Yeah, so both sprinkler standards 4541 and 4515, they have some modifications to them. It doesn't really change the design of your sprinkler. It just says what it can and it cannot include for consenting purposes. The alarm standard didn't require such modifications, and the Australian standard, because it cites an Australian alarm standard, that's had to be modified so we comply with the New Zealand alarm requirements. And that's all in the appendix in CAS2.
Another question again, I think you covered this, but will the wireless interconnected smoke alarms, will they still function if the power is cut?
You should have battery backup, or they're running solely on battery power. And again, they're connected with radio frequency. So as long as your alarms have power from batteries, the interconnectivity will also work.
Yeah. If there's a type 1 system in a building, Is it required to be listed on a compliance schedule?
MB has issued some guidance to that effect, which is on the building.gov.nz website. Inside a household unit, no, those are exempt from compliance schedules. You don't need to. But the recommendation from MB is if you have a dentist office with a security system with some smoke alarms attached to it, then technically, yes, they should be on a compliance schedule.
Do the interconnected smoke alarms require regular inspection and maintenance, either on a frequency like annually? Is there some sort of additional cost there for owners to get them maintained?
The owner can do all of that themselves. There are requirements for inspection and maintenance. It's in 4514, which is freely available. It is in the back there, like the test that you have to do. It's pushing a button, make sure it works. As a very simplified version of that, but the owner cannot do everything themselves.
And just a clarification of 4512. You mentioned that it has requirements for VADs. Are VADs required throughout a building in accordance with the standard?
No, they are not. The alarm standard is updated, so the specifications are improved. But the requirements for VADs would come from the designer of the building, depending on the requirements. Right now, CAS2 has no such requirements. But if the fire engineer, the owner, wants them installed, then that's what drives them.
There was another question. You talked about the sponsored standards. Is there anything we can do about this? That's information from the Australian standards. Can we get sponsorship of those? Or is that, or what does our sponsorship cover at least?
Our sponsorship covers the New Zealand standards, and then basically those we cite in our building code documents. So the Australian standards, any sponsorship of that would be hugely complicated and probably very expensive as well. I can't really speak to that, but right now the New Zealand standards, and like you said, Devin, there's how many of them? So pretty good job. Yeah.
Yeah, and some of it's limited by copyright issues as well. We're unable to provide access to for free. All right. Someone just asked a basic question about the presentation. Is it going to be available online? Yes, we will have the presentation online. The new AS and VMs are already live. You can go download those today. This presentation is going to be recorded and posted online. Another question here about standards. The hydrant standard 4510. It was updated in 2022. Why was it not included in the previous consultation, or is this part of this update?
When we published the public consultation document, it hadn't been published yet, and we cannot ask people's opinion on a standard that at that point just wasn't available yet, because it was I think it was published 6 months after we proposed these changes. So that's why I kind of missed the boat on that. So it's definitely still on the radar to be updated with a future building code update.
Yeah, and we try to consult regularly on those updates to make sure that if there are changes in standards, we are capturing them when we can. We are still working through a little bit of a backlog here, but that's why we've created our update kind of process and phases to make sure those things start recurring regularly to give people some predictability about when these will be coming out. A few more questions about CAS1, Tania. I'm going to try and find a few of them that are related. There was one about the means of escape and the minimum width that's specified. Why was the minimum width specified as per D1 AS1 as opposed to NZS 4121?
We align width and height of escape routes with CS2, and the requirement is less strict than D1, and they are less strict than 4.1.1. So theoretically, designer may add additional requirements for escape route if necessary to counter for accessibility. But otherwise, we've been having comments from public why we asking for more strict requirements for escape routes than CS2. So after considering public feedback, we actually align them exactly with CS2. No changes.
There's a question about the external escape route. So the 1 meter width under CAS 1 paragraph 3353. Does this area have to be clear? If it's forming part of the escape route, does it have to be clear? Can there be clotheslines or landscaping in that meter width?
Well, landscaping on escape routes not quite complying with requirements. It should be absolutely clear. We don't have exit way as such requirements in CS1 because we're only assuming it's going to be external safe path outside. But yeah, maybe we should be more clear on this part. No, definitely no landscaping for escape paths.
Another question about the escape path, this one related to the path length measured down the length of stairs or across intermediate floors. So in CAS1, are you required to do a multiplier like 1.2 times the length of the stairs?
Well, there is different definition of how you travel basically and measure these travel distances in CVM2 and CS2. And CVM2, you applying actual travel distances, and it's covered by a speed of travel for vertical or horizontal travel. CS2 is very, very conservative document. It does not include any allowance for speed of travel in different vertical or horizontal orientations. So CS2 including multipliers. CS1 took an approach that we can actually use for simplicity as simple travel distances without multipliers. We are covering life safety more by provision of early detection, wireless smoke detection, but we decided to keep this affordable and simple solution as it's our intent. We decided a simple way without using multipliers in CS1.
Yeah, and the difference in CAS1 is that the stair travel might be quite limited. You might be 1 or 2 stories. So the difference between adding a multiplier or not, it doesn't really affect the overall travel distance measured.
Overall, it's short travel distances, it's early warning, and people are familiar with escape routes because it's household unit and it's all completely independent escape routes. So a lot of basically margins there for safety.
Another question about the scope of CAS1. In the consultation document, we had proposed requirements that would allow for self-employed businesses within that use. Can you tell me what happened to that portion of the proposal?
Well, we proposed last year extensively to change scope of CS1. That was inclusion of various type of multi-unit dwellings up to 3 stories. We also try to clarify uses which are permitted in risk group SH1, SH. We try to include accommodations, various accommodation, and also a business activity. At that time, it was, if you remember, a lot of COVID lockdowns, and council was asking us to clarify what businesses are permitted or not permitted in residential houses, because a lot of people have to provide for families and start working from home and apply for some changes for their residential houses. Unfortunately, we've got a huge pushback and feedback. A lot of people was agree and a lot of people been disagree. We basically in position that it was absolutely mixed feedback, just about 50-50. So we decided to withdraw all these proposals at this time, and our scope remaining in the status quo. We're still considering how we will reflect all this feedback and what is way forward from now.
Somebody else has asked about the scope of CAS1. Does it cover simple low occupancy buildings, such as holiday park cabins? Is that within the scope of risk group SH?
Cabins, okay, it's absolutely different classified use. Because if you look at my understanding, these cabins, it's something, because there was a question, if you have a camping grounds, it's not typically risk group SH1. It's very simple buildings, but they have to be designed under CS2 or verification method. It's not residential building. It's somewhere where accommodation is provided. If it's your land and you having like a teeny house before you build your main one, it would be covered by SH group. But if it's a cabin within camping ground, or I don't know what else can be like this, multi-household, and it's actually run as a business operation, it's not risk group SH1.
Yeah, and some of that may determine, maybe dependent on how many people are there. There are provisions in CAS1 that limits the accommodation and how many people are in that accommodation. So fewer than 6 people. So yeah, it's definitely something. It still would have to be addressed on a case-by-case building basis based on the building and its use. I saw a few more questions here about the standards again. Saskia, there was one that asked again about, I'll just repeat what we said about the sprinkler standard. It is not sponsored for free. The sprinkler standard, you do have to pay for access, and there's a couple issues there around copywriting and the material that we can't get around.
Yeah, so it's partially sponsored. The price has reduced from, I think, $400 before we sponsored these standards to about 100 something. So we have cut the price down, but not to zero, unfortunately.
There's other questions here. I think I saw 2 of the same question about table 2.3. A couple people have picked up that some of the requirements for sleeping combined with other occupancies used to say type 4, and now they say type 5. Do you just want to clarify the definition of type 5 as it's used in the new acceptable solution and why this changed?
Yeah, so a type 4 is a fire alarm system with smoke detection throughout the building and manual call points. A type 5 is a type 4 plus enhanced sleeping area coverage, which means that you can have local smoke alarm, smoke detector with a hush feature as long as there's heat detection in the room. So obviously the type 5 part of the alarm is for the sleeping areas only, and the rest of the building is still type 4. So nothing really changes. It's just the wording of it. The entire building is covered by smoke detectors. Just the sleeping areas are allowed to have those special features.
Yep. Again, another question about interconnected smoke alarms. This was said to be the most interesting topic before people signed up. I can see that now. The minimum battery life requirement. So what's the minimum battery life required within
10 years? Yeah. So it's the 10-year battery is supposed to be in there.
And same thing, does that apply for the heat alarms under the standard? Can they be provided with a 10-year battery, or do they have to be hardwired?
That's up to you. If you want to hardwire them, go for it. Or if you want the battery operated one, the standard allows for both options, and it's up to the homeowner to decide whether he wants to wire them in or use batteries. But if you use batteries, they should be the long life kind.
Yep. Another person asked if the standards are currently on the New Zealand Standards website. Yes, they are. They were published last year, the fire alarm standards. So they are available on Standards New Zealand website. AS 1668, where can people get that one?
That would be SIA Global, I believe, is the website for that, or Australian Standards website.
Somebody's asked Tania again about the external escape routes, or external safe paths, actually. Does the total escape route length apply if it's within the allowable dead end open path, including the external part?
Okay, travel distances we allow up to safe path, and safe path itself, we're not having requirements for safe path from memory.
Yeah, I think they're asking about the external safe path. So once you're outside your house, do you still have to measure travel distances to a final exit?
There is a figure, I believe, and we show that it have to be measured until you reach the safe path. And safe path can be quite distance. We understand that in some configurations you might have several buildings on site. So theoretically, we don't have a limitation as CS2 for length of safe path until you reach street or open space.
A question about the CVM1 update. So it currently cites the 2001 version of 2918, the standard there. Was the updating it to the newest version, or the latest version, the 2018 version, considered as part of this update?
It was considered, but we spoke to the Home Heating Association, and it's not, the standard doesn't work well for New Zealand. I can say that currently AS 2918, was it? It's a joint standard. It's currently under revision. We're on the committee, so hopefully next year there'll be a newer one. There's more New Zealand input into that version, and hopefully what comes out will be something that can be cited, and CVM1 will be updated.
Somebody's asked about the firefighting requirements of, I just want to reiterate, we didn't change any of the firefighting requirements in CAS1. That was kind of out of scope. And if you look at the building code provisions themselves and regulations, a lot of the typical housing that you would find in CAS1 are excluded from those requirements. So that's part of the reason why it was out of scope. Another question about the F7 warning systems update, Saskia. Has it been updated with new smoke alarm requirements?
So F7 AS1 has been gutted out, gutted. We've taken the requirements for fire alarms and sprinklers and put them in CAS2. And the requirements for domestic smoke alarms, we've removed that, and CAS1 and CAS2 now go straight, refer straight to NZS 4514. So if you look at the current F7 AS1, you won't find any information there directly, but you'll be referred to CAS1, CAS2 as applicable.
Someone else has asked about sleep outs. So buildings up to 30 meters squared, do they require interconnected smoke alarms?
Sleep outs, anywhere where people are sleeping, you should have smoke alarms, smoke detection, some form of smoke detection. Smaller units like sleep outs, etc. You can get the smoke alarm, and larger buildings, you'll have to have a properly installed fire alarm system.
All right, I'm seeing a lot of questions here. Some of them we're unable to answer. They're requests for guidance or things that are kind of outside what we can cover today. I'm not seeing new questions coming in. So I think we might wrap it up there. We will be recording all these questions. We'll take a look at the ones we might be able to answer after the webinar. If there's any more additional clarifications, we can send those out or at least post them online. But I want to thank everybody for attending today and submitting your questions. Like I said, we haven't lost sight of these. It's just that some we can't. They're a little bit more detailed than what we can answer here in today's webinar. I want to thank Saskia and Tania for attending and everyone who signed up. For now, we are going to take a little bit of a break. And if you want to come back in another hour, we'll be here talking about our plumage and drainage updates. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you later.